Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into the incredible story of how the United States transformed during the 20th century, going from a regional player to, well, the world's only superpower. It's a tale of military strength, cultural influence, and a whole lot of tough choices that literally shaped the world we live in today. So let's get into it. Our story kicks off right here, with this one single massive explosion in Havana Harbor. It's wild to think about, right? How could the destruction of just one ship trigger a chain reaction that would completely redraw the map of global power? That's the exact question we're going to unravel.
Okay, so the first chapter starts with the Spanish-American War. Now, this wasn't just some local spat. No way. This was America's big, loud entrance onto the world stage, a conflict that screamed, "We're here and we're a major military force."
What's just astounding is how fast all of this happened. I mean, the USS Maine explosion was the spark for sure. But the US already had its eyes on Cuba for economic reasons. And, it wanted the old European empires out of its neighborhood. In just a few months, America went from bystander to fighting battles literally on the other side of the world. The whole thing, sparked by Cuba's fight for independence, was over in a mere 10 weeks.
This one phrase, it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. "Remember the Maine" became this electrifying rallying cry that turned a mysterious disaster into a full-blown national cause. It was everywhere, splashed across newspapers, and it put a ton of pressure on President McKinley to go to war.
And boom, this slide just says it all, right? With guys like Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders becoming overnight heroes, the U.S. pulled off a quick, decisive win. This wasn't just about winning a war, though. It was a crystal-clear demonstration of what we call hard power, using military and economic muscle to get what you want. The world was officially on notice.
But here's the twist. Military might? That was just Act 1. The next, and you could argue much trickier, part of America's rise wouldn't be fought with cannons and ships. Nope. It would be fought with ideas, with books, and with personal connections. The game was shifting from hard power to the much more subtle game of soft power.
So, okay, how do you win hearts and minds? Well, for the U.S., a huge part of the answer was to turn its universities into these global hubs. The strategy was basically this: bring the world's best and brightest, their future leaders, to America and build a powerful, long-lasting network of influence.
And this little story, man, it just brings the whole thing to life. Picture this. It's 1951, deep in the American heartland, and a local postmistress named Rosella Switzer invites 7 Nigerian students over for a chat. She was just curious, but what she got was what one magazine called an earful, a totally direct, unfiltered report on how America looked from the outside, right in the thick of the Cold War.
And here's the bombshell. The students explained that their anti-colonial hero back home actually saw communism as a better bet for equality. Why? Specifically because of America's racial segregation. Think about that. A conversation in some small-town Kansas living room was laying bare this huge global struggle. America's problems at home were becoming its biggest vulnerabilities abroad. So you see, that chat in Kansas, it wasn't just a one-off thing. It was a serious wake-up call. It showed that what these international students thought and felt was a crucial battleground in the Cold War. And that realization led to a much more organized approach. These weren't just students anymore. They were seen as future leaders, potential allies who could shape their own countries for decades.
And they actually had a blueprint for this. It's fascinating. First, you got selection. Carefully pick the best and brightest, the people who are going to be running things one day. Second, diffusion. The idea was that these students would soak up American values and ways of doing things and then spread them when they went back home. And third, legitimation. The hope was that their good experiences here would make them powerful, believable voices for the U.S. in their own countries. It was a long game, a real investment in global influence.
But, and this is a huge but, there was this massive, glaring hole in the strategy. The ideals of freedom and democracy they were selling were clashing big time with the reality of segregation that students saw with their own eyes. They were being pitched an American dream that didn't always line up with what they saw on the street or in a waiting room like this one.
And Rosella Switzer's quote just hits the nail on the head. She figured out that the Cold War wasn't just being fought by diplomats in far-off countries. It was happening right there, in her town, in the simple struggle to get those Nigerian students a haircut or a decent seat at the movies. Every little act of kindness or prejudice was a battle for the world's heart and mind.
So you take this mix of hard power and soft power, play it out over decades of intense Cold War competition, and eventually, as the Soviet Union starts to weaken, the US finds itself right on the edge of something totally new: complete global dominance.
In those final years of the Cold War, the US really leaned into promoting human rights and free market capitalism. And this wasn't just about being idealistic, it was a killer strategy. By championing things like individual liberty, it stoked a desire for freedom around the world that put enormous pressure on the closed, top-down Soviet system, basically helping it rot from the inside out.
And what you get is this, the unipolar moment. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that two-superpower world just vanished. For the first time in modern history, the entire international system had just one single center of gravity, the United States, with power that nobody else could even come close to match.
So how did the US pull this off? Well, the argument is that it wasn't just about having the biggest army or the most money. America was able to punch above its weight because of that soft power stuff. The appeal of its democratic values, its strong alliances, and its support for freedom movements gave it a kind of influence that you can't just count up in dollars or tanks.
But here's the thing about being on top. It comes with its own set of massive challenges. Being the only superpower isn't easy or simple. In fact, it's full of contradictions. And that brings us to what's known as the paradox of power. This chart does a great job of laying out the two sides of the same coin. On one hand, the benefits are obvious: incredible influence, the power to shape global rules, and being a magnet for the world's best talent. But the flip side, the costs are staggering: incredibly expensive military duties, and the very real risk of unintended consequences, like interventions that cause governments to collapse, creating vacuums that breed chaos and terrorism. The great paradox is that the very things you do to stay on top can actually weaken you over time.
So there you have it. We've traced this incredible journey from a single ship's explosion all the way to this unipolar moment, a 100-year climb to a height of power that the world had never really seen before. And all of that leaves us with one massive question to think about. If that was the story of the last century, what's going to be the story of this one? Thanks for watching.